I'd like to welcome Wayne Pitchford. Wayne spoke the other day on Sunday afternoon. Wayne is a professor from Adelaide University, and Wayne, I think we'll crack into it. Okay.
Thanks a lot, Graham. After my talk on Sunday, I was talking to Russell Priest, and he said to me that it appears that we found an honest Aussie. That's really quite a rare thing. Oh, there's Russell here. And we got talking later, and we talked about the number of times that I've been over here and how I've built up very good friendships with a lot of people over many years now. And he said, you've been here so many times, you're almost an honourable Kiwi. And clearly I thought an honourable Kiwi was an oxymoron. Now that I've got you all offside, it's great to be here. What I'm planning to do today is to report on the results of our maternal productivity project, which I've actually done in this very room before. But I'm glad to today to be able to report some of the economic analysis that we've done, and our attempt, albeit a bit lame in many ways, but our attempt to put some dollar values on the results that we've found. And so I'm hoping that you'll find that interesting in that update on the project. Because there's a fair amount of detail, I've produced a handout, so a selection of my slides are in a loose leaf in the brochure that you have. I'd like to start by inviting you to a conference which is in 2 months' time in Adelaide, in my hometown. We're putting it on with the New Zealand Society, and we've got a focus on animal welfare and livestock productivity, and just be great to have a lot of you come over and join us for the conference. So I'm going to focus straight in on the research that we did. We had 4 lines of cattle, and we had high and low, what we refer to high and low fat lines. Now these were Angus heifers that we bought from industry, and we bought them based on their rib fat EBVs, and they represented at the time the top and bottom 10% of the Angus breed for rib fat EBV. So they're not selection lines, they're groups of heifers that have been bought from industry and brought onto research stations. The other group of animals I'm not going to talk about today, but I need to put on the table that we ran these lines as well. These are selection lines for net feed intake or feed efficiency. They've been run in Australia for some time. They were selected for about 3 generations for net feed intake. And we've got the high and low lines there. One of the reasons I'm not focusing on the results from those lines is that we found something very interesting, and that is if you eat more, then you get fatter. Pretty sure that was exactly the thing that we found when we invested your levy money in our research, and that was the outcome from it. So the high NFI line in many ways were like the high fat line that I'm about to report, and the low NFI line were a lot like the low fat line. Not exactly the same, but in many ways they're similar. But I'm going to focus on the fat lines because those genotypes more closely represent what you see in industry. So we've got 2 lines, high and low fat, by 2 nutrition levels, high and low, and 2 sites, one in Western Australia and one in South Australia. And the data that I'm reporting in terms of feed intake, the basis of that, all the feed intake was done in groups. So we haven't got individual feed intake in the animals, we've got groups of animals where we've measured feed intake. So the first thing is, what were the EBVs of the heifers that we bought? Now, for those of you that are right up on current Angus EBVs, you need to wind your clock back 10 years because that was it's actually over 10 years ago when we were purchasing these heifers. So the top and bottom 10% at the time, the rib fat plus 1.1 millimetres average for the group, and the low fat ones minus 1.4. So a difference of 2.5 mils in rib fat, which is quite substantial in terms of the type of cattle that we sourced. And not surprisingly, the rump fat or P8 fat, they matched those pretty closely. When we went out and bought these cattle, we thought that the low fat ones may be larger frame, later maturing, bigger types of cattle. So we actively put limits around mature cow weight EBVs so that when we chose them, we wouldn't be ending up with animals that were different for size, but they would only be different for fat. Of course, we failed when we did that. We would have failed much worse if we didn't have those limitations on, but we still failed in that the difference in mature cow weight between those two is 14 kilograms, as I've highlighted down further. And there's also a slight difference in their reproduction EBV, the days to calving EBV, a difference of, a bit over a day in days to calving. So some of the fat results are partially confounded with growth and partially confounded with reproduction, but I think that we can still take a lot of conclusions from the results that we've got. So the first thing that I want to report is that those cows that were genetically fatter were always fatter. I mean, you can feed them less and you'll end up with them being leaner, but if you feed genetically leaner and genetically fatter cows the same amount of feed, the fatter ones will always be fatter. And so what you can see here, and I'll just try and get the mouse working, let's not worry too much about the higher lines. Just having trouble getting this. Here we go, pointer's working. Don't worry too much about the higher lines, that's the high nutrition treatment. And most of you, unless they were really good years, wouldn't be running your cattle in that level of conditions. So let's focus on the low nutrition lines. So the high fat line I've got here in blue and the low fat in black. And I think if you look at their condition over time, now that the horizontal axis here is time in years, but 1 is when they weaned their first calf, and then 2 is when they wean their second calf, 3 is when they wean their third calf. And not exactly the case, but what I want to point out is if you look at the fat profiles over time, you can see that they're going up and down with the seasons, but those lines are pretty much parallel. And so that difference in fatness is maintained pretty much throughout their life. Now, that does a couple of things. It actually gives you confidence to think about, well, what would happen if we actually allowed these to go further in condition? So if we look at the first couple of lines here, you can see they're declining. What we could do is we could say, well, if they're declining at the same rate and we had a threshold, you know, these are in body condition scores. By the way, they're not Kiwi condition scores. They're on a 1 to 5 scale, just in case you're wondering how hard we push their cattle. Given that they're declining there at the same rate, if let's just say here at 2.6 is your cutoff, well, what that means is it takes longer for the high fat ones to get to that threshold. So in our project, we were very good scientists and made sure that we treated all of the animals the same, so that whenever an animal triggered supplementary feeding, and in our the rules for our project were if a cow got to a condition score of 2 out of 5, then that would trigger supplementary feeding, and both the low fat and the high fat group would be fed at the same time, because you've got to treat them the same to be a good scientist. The problem with that is that the high fat ones were always fed more than they needed, because every single time it was a genetically low fat animal that triggered that supplementary feeding. So if you actually look at those lines, you can see that the high fat ones would have taken longer before they'd reach a threshold. So that means that the high fat ones actually could save supplementary feeding costs. Now just bear with me for a moment while I talk like an Australian. We use hay and we supplementary feed, and it doesn't mean necessarily that our cows do it easier. It just means that generally our producers have opportunities to be able to do that, and I acknowledge the fact that often you don't have those facilities, and if they're just up in the hills, then they've just got to tough it out. But just bear with me while I talk like an Aussie, and I'll try and come back to Kiwi issues later on. So what we found was that if you looked at how long does it take for a cow to decrease in condition from a condition score 3 to a condition score 2, if that took 2 months, so here's 2 for example, if it took 2 months to drop from a condition score 3 to a 2, that means that the high fat line would not need supplementary feeding for 15 days longer after the low fat line. So it could actually save a lot of supplementary feed. that happens in autumn for our guys, and some of our producers have looked at that and said, far out, that's the difference between going away on holidays with the family versus being able to stay at home and having to feed out hay. So we think that's quite a significant effect, both in lifestyle and in income. So now let me get into some of the costings on the project. What I've tried to present here is a pretty significant advantage of the high-fat animals. So here's the structure of the project, the 64 groups of cattle, and we had weekly feed intakes on these groups, 64 groups of cattle for 3.5 years. So there's a lot of data in there. I won't go through that too much. Firstly, the weaning weight. Now, Graham started off by saying that EBV's work is one of the main messages you've found early on. Well, let me assure you that that is right. You know, I showed you earlier that the low-fat animals had higher EBVs for growth, and I want you to focus on the low nutrition, so it's the bars on the right. But you know, the low-fat one, ones under low nutrition, the low-fat animals had slightly heavier calves, exactly as you'd expect based on their breeding values, slightly heavier calves at weaning. But if you actually look at not how heavy are the calves, but if you said, well, what is their weight of calf wean per cow join, so you take reproduction into account as well, then it's actually the other way around, because not surprisingly, the high-fat ones probably reached puberty earlier and certainly had higher pregnancy rates as young cows, and so they actually wean more calf. And then if you go a step further and have that as a productivity measure, and I've got this in grams of calf per unit of energy going into the cow and calf unit, you can see they're under a low nutrition regime that the high-fat ones were significantly more productive on that maternal productivity measure. So then and that's about the results that I got to last time I was here 3 years ago. So then you'd think, obviously, that the high-fat animals would be more profitable when you modelled a whole herd. Well, let me steal my own thunder and say that that's not correct. It's actually the other way around. So what we did is we started looking at the reproduction in these things, and what I've got here is young cow reproduction and mature cow reproduction. And as young cows, and I guess focus on the stripy bars here, the ones under low nutrition. As young cows, what you want a heifer to do is to get in calf, have that calf, raise that calf, and get back in calf. That's the job description. I think Steve put up a really good job description on Sunday afternoon. That's one of the job descriptions for a heifer. Get in calf, raise a calf, and get back in calf. Well, what percentage of those actually did the job? And for the low fat line, so that's the bar on the far right under the young cow one, only 66% of those girls actually did the job. Whereas the high fat ones, it was I think 77% or something like that. Significantly more cows were able to get in calf, raise a calf, and get back in calf. So that's as heifers, and then getting back in calf when they've got their first lactation. Once they've done that job, they were all the same. So if you look on the right-hand bars under mature cows, their reproduction was all the same. The low-fat ones were not worse. Now, it is possible we didn't push them hard enough, but it's also possible that once you culled out those that didn't get in calf a couple of times, the reality is they keep going on and keep doing the job. And this is a pointer for why the differences in profitability are not as big, or not even the same direction as what you would necessarily expect. So in the Northern Australian project, they're thinking about, do we actually need a new breeding value for a thing called WOP? Now, WOP is a trait called wet and pregnant. And a heifer that has got in calf and has raised that calf and is currently lactating and then gets back in calf, she's wet and pregnant. Wet as in lactating, and pregnant again. There's quite a lot of genetic variation in that trait, and it's something worth thinking about in terms of future EBVs. Let me move on. What I want to do now is explain the actual economic analysis. We assume that we've got a self-replacing herd of 1,000 cows. The cows calve in June and they're joined in September. So that's kind of similar to you guys if you just added a couple of months to it, I assume. At the end of the year, the cows are pregnancy tested, the calves are weaned, and the non-pregnant heifers and cows are sold, the non-lactating cows are sold, the old cows are sold, and the weaner steers and some of the weaner heifers are sold. So that's all the sales that have actually gone on. And what we've done is we've used our data, which is up to when they wean their third calf, and we've just gone a couple more and assumed that the results would be the same if we gave them 2 more opportunities, so up to having their fifth calf weaned. So it's firstly important to look at what's our herd structure look like. So if you actually added up all of the bars on the right-hand side for each of these 4 scenarios, so high and low fat by high and low nutrition, so if we added up the number of cows that are yearling, those that have got their first calf at foot, second calf, third, fourth, fifth calf at foot, that would add up to 1,000 cows. So we've got 4 herds here with a different structure in their herd. And if we look at the low-fat animals, can you see that the low nutrition ones, the low-fat ones have more young cows than the high-fat ones, because you need to be bringing, because their reproduction when they were young was worse, you need to bring more young ones into the system. So how many weaners need to be retained to maintain a cow herd of 1,000 cows? And this 1,000 cows would be 1,000 cows, all pregnancy tested in calf, ready to rock and roll for the next year. So if we look at the weaners, we got about 206 on low nutrition, about 260 weaners needing to be maintained, whereas about for the low-fat ones, about 300. So at least 40 more weaners required, heifer weaners required to be able to maintain a herd of 1,000 cows. So it kind of makes sense. Lower reproduction when they're young, got to retain more animals for that herd to work. But once you get out to the right-hand side, there's very little difference in the age profile because those young ones have dropped out of the system early on. So now let's look at what prices I've actually put on to do these economic analyses. So the first thing, we costed pasture at 0.35 cents per megajoule, and if you assume that that was sort of average pasture quality, works out about $40 a tonne of dry matter of pasture. And then we costed hay, assuming it was about 9 megajoules, and it was about $140 a tonne. That works out at 1.6 cents per megajoule. They're probably not units that you're used to thinking about, but hopefully the dollars per tonne of dry matter is more what you're used to. Now, we did the economic analysis before the rise in beef prices. So the values that we used were $1.90 a kilogram for weaners, $1.50 for cull heifers, and $1.30 for cull cows. Now, my experience in talking to farmers is that if they don't remember any of the science, what they really want to know is what price is cattle in Australia at the moment and what's that in New Zealand dollars. So I've put in red some information for you. So the current values in Australia, and I got these literally just before I came over, $2.90 for weaners, $2.50 for cull heifers, and $2 for cull cows. Now, I've given you live weight values to match with what we've done our costings for this project. And if you convert that to New Zealand dollars, and $3.12, so over $6 for weaner carcasses if you had such a thing. Not sure how that compares to what you've got at the moment, but I do know that you've had a rise in beef prices as we have. Okay, so let's use those prices, apply a cost of feed, look at the returns from the animals, look at the weights of the animals coming out of the system. Remember that the low-fat ones were not only low-fat, but they were also slightly bigger. So they grew a bit faster. The cows were bigger. The cows ate a bit more, but they actually produced a bigger calf. So let's look at what happened. So in terms of the value, and this is in dollars, there's a gross margin in dollars per breeding cow. And the low-fat ones, they're at about $280 per breeding cow, and the high-fat ones at about $240. Exactly the opposite way around to what you'd expect based on those early reproduction values that I told you. The bottom line is, because the difference between premium beef and grinding beef prices is not that much, the cost of a cow not raising a calf is also not that great, because she'll gain a fair bit of condition and she gets to be sold at reasonable meat prices. And we've done some sensitivity analysis around the cost of hay and around the cost of the difference between cow beef prices and and weaner prices, and the conclusions are pretty robust. It's not, you can't say it's because of the prices that we chose. Unless, of course, the US market completely dropped out and it was completely reliant on young animals. That'd be an extreme scenario. But it's fairly insensitive to the prices that we chose. And the low-fat ones actually ended up more profitable. So I've blocked out some of the detail here, but why were they more profitable? What was it about them? So if you actually look through, well, and I'm focusing on the stripy bars here because it's under low nutrition, slightly more income from the low-fat ones, probably because they're bigger. And there was also more large animals sold, like you're raising more weaners coming into the system, but more of those dropped out of the system. Dropping out is not always bad because it actually is income that is retained. Pasture expenses, well, it costs slightly more to feed the low-fat ones because they were bigger. Supplementary feed, well, the high-fat ones actually required more supplementary feed, but earlier I told you that they'd require less. Now the problem here is what we're modelling is what actually occurred. It's not what could have occurred, it's what actually occurred. And because we maintained our high-fat ones in a higher condition than what they needed to be, we had to feed a lot of hay to be able to do that. And so when you looked at the amount of hay that went in and the cows, number of cows and the income that came out, that's the costings that came out of the system. So the low-fat ones actually are more profitable when you do those costings. So that's all good, but I don't think that quite reflects reality. In reality, you don't put a cost on your pasture because you have a farm that is a fixed size and you have a fixed pasture resource. So we actually said, well, what happens if we tried to model a farm that doesn't actually say, I can just buy more pasture or pasture costs a certain amount. What happens if we didn't put a cost on pasture, but we actually said there is a fixed pasture resource? And so in this scenario, we actually decided we got a model farm which was 700 hectares with 600 millimetres of rain. And that's our fixed pasture resource. And then our variable things that we've got are how many sales could we have in the system and what's the cost of hay, assuming that even if you didn't buy in hay, at least there's an opportunity cost in being able to sell hay off the property. So we still put a value on the supplementary feed, but not on the pasture cost. So we've taken the cost off pasture. We said that there's a fixed amount of pasture. We've got the same dollar values on weaners, cull heifers and cull cows. So then what we did was an optimisation program. We said, well, under this scenario, given that we've got cows of certain size and certain condition, when you run that scenario, what's the optimum number of cows for each system to run on that farm? So we actually allowed each of the 4 systems, so the high, low fat by high and low nutrition. We know how much they ate, we know what condition they were, so we said, well, what's the optimum number of cows to run on a farm? And then when you do that, what's the profitability of those farms? And instead of being on a per cow basis, we now do it on a per hectare basis. So we're hoping that that more reflects what would happen in the real world. So what do you think's going to happen? Do you think, which one's actually going to be better? Well, I'll go straight to the results. And surprisingly to me, the differences were the same really as when we did the costings the other way around. And even maybe slightly more extreme. So the low fat ones, and I'm focusing on the stripy bars again because they're the low nutrition ones. The low fat ones just under $350 a hectare gross margin. The high fat ones around $250 a hectare gross margin. And so that's quite a big, $100 a hectare for a 700 hectare farm, quite a big difference in returns for that farm. So why did that occur? How was it able to be that big? What were the drivers behind that difference in profitability there? So let's look at the individual detail. If we look at gross margins per cow, they're exactly the same. Hay costs slightly higher for the low fat than the high fat. So it's around the other way from last time. If you looked at how many cows the optimum was to put on the system, look at the huge difference between the number of cows under the low fat regime versus the high fat regime. So the high fat genetic line. So that's not actually in dollars, that one, that's in number of cows. So under the, so I'm looking at this middle scenario here. The low fat one, under low nutrition, those cows were the ones that were really in their working clothes. And it's saying that we can put, 940 cows on a 700 hectare farm, whereas the optimum scenario for the high genetically fat animals, because these animals were being, in our scenario, they were being fed more than they needed. And so I think that's why this has happened. But it's saying really you could only put 700 of those cows on. Well, not surprisingly, if you've got more cows, you need more supplementary feed, but you've also got a lot more income. And so when you looked at the income, the dollar per cow was a lot higher. The dollar per farm was heaps higher for the low-fat animals. So there's some odd sort of things here that are going on in terms of the number of cows that go on. I don't know how helpful this analysis is to you, but maybe it should provide some comfort that the results came out the same way as when we put a cost on pasture. So let's just summarise which one's best. On low nutrition, the low-fat ones, $281 per breeding cow versus high-fat $235. So a difference of $46 per cow. But if we'd run the genetically high-fat ones in the same condition as low-fat, then that $42 difference would only take 29 days of supplementary feeding to be completely eroded. So maybe they're not so different. And then when we actually model the whole farm, the difference was $94, but there was 37% more cows for the low-fat regime, and that would only take 43 days of supplementary feeding for that to be completely eroded as well. So in many ways, I think the differences in profitability are not that great. They come down to your actual system. And let's just think about your actual system. So I don't understand your system as well as you do, but I acknowledge that your system would be calving later, joining later and weaning later. Many of you don't have options for supplementary feed, but if you were going to do this sort of analysis, would you actually cost feed that would be allocated to a sheep enterprise? Could that be treated as equivalent to hay, or at least costing it at a higher value than what, say, breeding cows would get? And then the real issue is, what would happen if the cows were pushed harder? What would happen if those high-fat, genetically high-fat animals were actually run in a harder scenario? And that's the real issue that needs to be addressed. That's the sort of thing that will be addressed through our collaboration with Steve and other people in beef and lamb genetics in trying to have a biological model to see what would happen under different scenarios, try and get some data that will actually back up that model, and then put some economic values when we can actually have really well modelled the biology in a range of scenarios, rather than what we did, which is just putting economic values on what actually happened in the past. We'd be able to look at some scenarios. So with that, thank you very much for listening. It's great to be back here.
Thanks very much, Wayne. We've got time for a question or two. So down here, is it Robert?
Yeah. One of the issues was your skinny cows had a higher EBV for growth. But if you selected for cows that had high fat and high growth, that would change your figures quite a bit. And as you said towards the end, rather than feeding the fat cows just because the skinny cows needed it, if you didn't feed them until they needed it, that would have made them a lot cheaper to run, and the breeding values would have given you bigger calves as well.
Very good summary, thank you. I assume that wasn't a question. There's nothing to say to that. Yeah, it's a perfect summary.